Well, the PM has signed a new defence pact with Indonesia that will see our two countries build more military training centres in Indonesia. The agreement could potentially lead to an ongoing ADF presence in Indonesia. Joining me to discuss is Director at Strategic Analysis Australia, Peter Jennings. Peter, thanks for coming on the program tonight. The PM says this is the biggest agreement in 30 years between our two countries. How significant is it? And I can see you smirking already. Talk to me.
Well, every defence announcement that this government makes is the biggest announcement since the last announcement they've made, James. It just gets a bit ridiculous. And in particular with the Prime Minister, what we seem to be getting now is almost every country he goes to, there's a new treaty-level agreement that's being signed. The truth of the matter is that defence cooperation is built on trust. Trust takes a long time to be established. And you actually have to have military forces that are able to be out there in the region in order to establish contact and to provide a basis for training. Now, in the case of Indonesia, I think it's extremely unlikely that we'll see Australian troops based there because Indonesia has, since its independence, been strongly part of the non-aligned movement and has objected to the idea of foreign military forces being based on its soil. So, you know, from the point of view of government-to-government talks, to make it look as though Albanese and President Prabowo have a reasonable relationship, that's fine. But we should expect for this to make haste very slowly when it comes to practical defence cooperation, because it's not easy. And in fact, Indonesia has other priorities.
You're quite right. You know, just thinking as you're speaking, we've pretty much announced a defence pact with everybody except Greenland over the last little while. So there you go. Negotiators from the US and Iran met over the weekend, their first meeting since June last year when the US bombed Iran's nuclear facilities. Where are the talks at? And is there a sense that war might be averted in the Middle East because of these talks?
Well, for war to be averted, there has to be a convincing Iranian compromise made to say that they will stop reprocessing nuclear fuel and allow that to be moved to another country, and that they will stop killing protesters. They're the two things that the Trump White House has demanded. I can't see the Iranian regime doing it. What I think is more likely is we're going to see them stalling for a period of time. And really what that does is put Trump into a situation where he's going to have to make a decision at some stage in the next few weeks about, does he use the military power which he's now built up in the Gulf, or does he allow the Iranian regime to get away with what I suspect is going to be non-compliance rather than a serious change of heart over building their nuclear weapons program. So I think we just need to keep watching. I think it's going to be very hard for a believable agreement to be struck. And what that means is that the risk of military conflict remains pretty high, but is delayed for some time until the Americans come to the conclusion that Iran is not being serious about negotiations.
And just quickly, Peter, with the Ayatollah now under serious pressure, there's reports that the Iranian diaspora, even here in Australia, are being targeted by individuals linked to the Islamic Republic. There were reports in the Australian at the weekend about Iranian Australians who've spoken out against the regime, receiving all sorts of phone calls in the middle of the night, threats about family in Iran and indeed their own safety here. How prevalent do you think this is, and how can it be allowed, a situation in which Australians are being threatened by a foreign regime here on Australian soil?
Well, this is something that ASIO head Mike Burgess has been warning about for some years now in his public speeches, James. He talks about foreign powers engaging in espionage and political interference in Australia, and I think Iran has to be very high on that list, particularly as we now know that they were responsible for 2 terrorist-related acts at the end of 2024. So I think it is correct that the Iranian diaspora community should be worried in Australia, and we need to be making sure that our police and intelligence services are on top of this threat, which I think becomes even higher at a point of tension inside Iran, in Tehran right now. So we should take these warnings very seriously. I think this does give rise to what should be a high level of concern about further terrorist-type actions in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely, especially in light of what we've seen over the last couple of months. Peter Jennings, thanks so much for joining me.